Inside the cold concrete of ADX Florence, where America locks away its most dangerous men, a silent war never stopped. It just went underground. The Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, Black Guerrilla Family, gangs that once ruled the yard now control a network from within solitary cells. This isn't just prison life, it's organized crime evolution. Before we dive into how the Alcatraz of the Rockies became a breeding ground for gang intelligence, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we expose ADX Florence, the evolution of prison gangs. ADX Florence didn't emerge from nowhere, it was born from fear. By the late 1980s, America's prison system was spinning out of control. Inmates were assaulting staff, orchestrating riots, and forming alliances across state lines. In facilities like Marion, Illinois, and Leavenworth, Kansas, guards were being stabbed in the hallways. The federal government realized something. Control was slipping. In 1983 at USP Marion, 2 correctional officers were brutally murdered in separate attacks by members of the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang that had risen to dominate the federal system. The killings shocked the Bureau of Prisons, BOP. Within hours, the entire institution was locked down, permanently. Marion became the first Supermax prison in the United States, where inmates were confined 23 hours a day. But Marion was only a prototype. By the early 1990s, violence, gang coordination, and nationwide networks forced officials to take the next step. Build something stronger, smarter, and utterly inescapable. In 1994, that vision became reality in the deserts of Colorado. ADX Florence. Known officially as the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, this was the end of the line, the place for inmates too violent for other prisons. Its walls stood 14 feet high, lined with razor wire and pressure-sensitive sensors. Inside, motion detectors and remote-controlled doors ensured no guard ever had to come close to an inmate unless necessary. The cells were concrete boxes, 7 by 12 feet with a slit for light and a reinforced steel door. To the public, ADX was a triumph of control. To the inmates, it was something else entirely, the death of the human spirit. But even here, isolation didn't kill the gangs. It forced them to evolve. For decades, groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, and the Black Guerrilla Family had ruled through violence, loyalty, and a code of silence. In lower security prisons, they could recruit in the yard, send messages through tattoos, and coordinate through corrupt guards or coded mail. But ADX changed the environment, and in doing so, it forced gang leaders to adapt like organisms in a new ecosystem. The Bureau of Prisons thought isolation would stop gang communication. Instead, it became a laboratory for innovation. Members used legal mail to pass coded messages. Some communicated through ventilation ducts, using rhythmic taps, a modern version of Morse code. Others relied on corrupt attorneys, visiting clergy, or family members who carried messages from one facility to another. And those messages still carried orders, for extortion, smuggling, and even murder. Inside ADX, the gangs didn't die. They got smarter. The prison's design, layers of control, cameras, and concrete, wasn't just physical. It was psychological. Everything was meant to break down identity. But identity is what gangs protect most. The Brotherhood tattooed shamrocks and lightning bolts on their flesh. The Mexican Mafia carried Laim, like a religion. And the BGF saw themselves as political soldiers. Even when separated, their belief systems became stronger. Their loyalty became myth. ADX Florence was supposed to end gang rule. Instead, it became their university. The same system designed to destroy them ended up teaching them patience, adaptation, and the art of surviving absolute isolation, turning impulsive killers into calculated strategists. By the late 1990s, federal agents realized that ADX wasn't just housing gang leaders, it was incubating a new kind of prison leadership. And that leadership was about to extend beyond the walls. If you want to understand how prison gangs survived inside the most secure prison in America, you start with the Aryan Brotherhood, the AB. They called themselves the Brand. To outsiders, they were just racist killers. But to those inside the system, they were something closer to an invisible government, one that could order a murder in Texas from a cell in Colorado. When the first wave of Aryan Brotherhood members arrived at ADX Florence in the mid-1990s, officials thought the move would finally end their control. Men like Barry the Baron Mills and Tyler Bingham, both high-ranking generals of the Brotherhood, were locked in separate cells hundreds of feet apart. They couldn't speak. They couldn't see each other. Guards monitored every move, every word, every letter. The Bureau of Prisons called it total control. But it wasn't total. Not even close. The Brotherhood adapted faster than anyone expected. Their code was simple: blood in, blood out. Membership for life. Betrayal meant death. That loyalty allowed them to function like a military unit even when isolated. When one soldier was silenced, another stepped up to relay orders through the system. Inmates on lower security yards became the messengers, attorneys became couriers, and legal documents became the battlefield. Investigators later uncovered letters disguised as legal briefs, written in tiny script between the lines of official paperwork. Inside those micro-coded messages were orders to attack rival inmates, collect drug debts, or recruit new soldiers. Some letters even included invisible ink, lemon juice that could only be read when heated. Prison mailroom staff rarely caught them, especially if the envelope was labeled attorney-client privilege. Even more chilling was how they managed to synchronize their operations without direct contact. Through family networks and coded communication, they established what FBI agents would later describe as a shadow hierarchy. Barry Mills, confined to his ADX cell nearly 23 hours a day, continued issuing commands for years. According to court records, Mills and Bingham directed at least 3 murders while serving life sentences. One of those killings was ordered through a chain of coded letters that started in Florence, traveled through a girlfriend in California, and ended in a state prison in Indiana, where an unsuspecting inmate was stabbed to death in the yard. For the Brotherhood, ADX became a command post, not a cage. The Bureau of Prisons tried countermeasures: intercepting mail, increasing surveillance, limiting visits, and monitoring phone calls. But every measure sparked a countermeasure. The AB learned to use the legal system itself as cover. They filed endless lawsuits, each filled with correspondence that could carry hidden orders. They knew the courts couldn't easily block legal mail without violating constitutional rights. In 2002, the FBI launched Operation Shotcaller, a multi-agency effort to dismantle the Aryan Brotherhood's leadership. Over 40 members were indicted, including Mills and Bingham, for orchestrating a decades-long campaign of murder, racketeering, and narcotics trafficking, all from inside federal prisons. Prosecutors laid out a chilling picture. Despite being isolated in Supermax confinement, the Brotherhood ran a nationwide criminal organization that stretched from California to Texas, with money flowing through family members, motorcycle clubs, and even corrupt correctional officers. The trial revealed an uncomfortable truth: ADX Florence had failed to stop gang leadership. It had only centralized it. By concentrating the top leadership of the Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, and others under one roof, ADX accidentally became a council of kings. Gang leaders began sharing techniques, understanding each other's communication methods, and even negotiating truces through indirect channels. The very men who once fought bloody wars in state yards were now confined together, forced to coexist in the silence of concrete. Out of that silence, something new was born, a kind of mutual respect among top gang leaders, built not on friendship but on necessity. FBI agent Terry Turchi, who led investigations into prison gangs during that era, later described ADX as the Pentagon of prison crime. He wasn't exaggerating. The evolution was subtle but deadly. Inside ADX, the Aryan Brotherhood no longer needed visible power. They had influence, psychological control. Their tattoos, clover leaves, lightning bolts, Viking helmets, became symbols not just of violence but of strategy. They had learned to weaponize patience. To them, 10 years in a concrete box wasn't punishment. It was an investment in fear, discipline, and legacy. But while the Aryan Brotherhood mastered isolation, another group was watching closely. A group far older, far more secretive, and just as deadly. They called themselves Laim, the Mexican Mafia. And their story inside ADX would prove that control wasn't about freedom of movement. It was about control of mind, message, and memory. If the Aryan Brotherhood built a military empire inside the federal system, Laim, the Mexican Mafia, built a nation. To most outsiders, IM means just one letter, M. But behind that single symbol lies one of the most structured, feared, and profitable criminal organizations in the history of American incarceration. Their motto was simple: Laim nunca muere, the M never dies. By the time ADX Florence opened its gates in 1994, Laim was already decades deep in dominance. Originating in the 1950s within California's dual vocational institution, it grew into a prison-based syndicate that controlled narcotics, extortion, and protection rackets across the West Coast. Members were known for ruthless discipline. One wrong move, one perceived betrayal, and your life was over. When federal authorities began transferring IM shot callers into ADX, they believed they were dismantling the hierarchy. But they underestimated something crucial: structure can survive separation. Inside ADX Florence, EAM generals like Benjamin Topo Peters and René Boxer Enriquez learned to treat isolation as strategy. They studied how information traveled through the prison system, the timing of mail, the routes of transport buses, the patterns of guard shifts. They used these details like chess pieces, moving communication across states with invisible precision. One of their most effective methods was ghost writing. Since inmates couldn't communicate directly, loyal soldiers in lower security prisons wrote letters for them, signed under different names, and used coded language to issue commands. For example, send 2 paintings to Los Angeles next week might actually mean move 2 kilos of meth to the LA area. The Bureau of Prisons intercepted hundreds of these messages but decoded only a handful. The real genius of LAIM was that it didn't depend solely on one leader. Every EAM member knew the rules: obey the constitution of the Mafia, collect taxes on drug trade, and maintain respect. The organization functioned like a decentralized network. If one leader was cut off, another instantly took his place. ADX didn't decapitate LAIM's leadership, it multiplied it. Over time, the federal system became an extension of the EAM's empire. Even from solitary cells, generals issued commands to entire states. They had connections with the Serenos, Southern California street gangs loyal to LAIM, who acted as their soldiers on the outside. The result was a prison-based intelligence system that reached beyond bars. In 2006, FBI investigations revealed that ADX inmates had directed multiple drug deals, extortions, and even assassinations across state lines. One intercepted message from an EAM general at Florence simply read, "Collect from the baker before sunrise." A week later, a low-level dealer in Los Angeles was found dead, shot twice in the head behind a bakery. Federal prosecutors called it a ghost command. No fingerprints, no phone calls, no meetings, just influence carried through a network of loyalty and fear. ADX Florence became something more than a supermax. It was a spiritual fortress for gangs that already thrived on discipline, secrecy, and fear. To the Mexican Mafia, confinement was confirmation of power. Only the elite got sent to Florence. Only the leaders deserved such isolation. Guards soon noticed that even when EAM members never spoke to each other, they still moved in rhythm. When one refused a meal, others did the same. When one filed a grievance, 5 others followed, across different housing units. No visible contact, yet perfect coordination. It was around this time that the Bureau of Prisons began using the phrase, gang nexus. They realized the problem wasn't just communication, it was ideology. These gangs had transcended physical interaction. Their power lived in the minds of their members. ADX staff attempted to break the cycle through step-down programs, allowing good behavior inmates to transition out of isolation. But even this system was exploited. Gang leaders used it as a reward structure, promising subordinates that loyalty and obedience would earn them transfers to easier prisons. The institution designed to destroy criminal hierarchies had, paradoxically, given them new tools to control. By the 2010s, federal intelligence estimated that at least 70% of ADX's long-term population had confirmed or suspected gang ties, from Aryan Brotherhood soldiers to Nuestra Familia lieutenants, from EAM generals to BGF commanders. The Supermax was no longer a cage for gangsters. It was a summit, where the silent elite of American prison crime gathered under one roof. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who worked there. As one retired corrections officer put it, ADX doesn't stop communication. It purifies it. The ones who can't adapt go insane. The ones who can, they become gods. But among those gods, another organization was rising. A group forged in political rebellion, disciplined in ideology, and unbroken by decades of solitary confinement. They were the Black Guerrilla Family. And unlike the others, their mission went far beyond crime. Their war was about revolution. Among the steel doors and fluorescent corridors of ADX Florence, there was one group that didn't see themselves as gangsters. They saw themselves as freedom fighters. The Black Guerrilla Family, BGF, wasn't born out of greed or racial supremacy like others. It was born out of ideology, a revolutionary doctrine built on discipline, education, and vengeance. Founded in 1966 by George Jackson inside California's San Quentin prison, the BGF saw itself as a Marxist, Leninist organization. Jackson, a brilliant, charismatic inmate serving time for armed robbery, turned his cell into a classroom, preaching resistance against oppression, racism, and systemic injustice in the prison system. He believed prison was not the end of the struggle but the front line. The men who listened became his soldiers. And when Jackson was shot and killed during an alleged escape attempt in 1971, the BGF turned him into a martyr, their own Che Guevara behind bars. By the time ADX Florence opened, the BGF had splintered. Some factions pursued political education, others pure violence. But in every cell where one of them landed, the ideology survived. Disciplined, silent, militant. ADX Florence, the so-called end of the line, soon became the perfect stage for the BGF's quiet evolution. While other gangs used the mail system for drugs or murder orders, BGF leaders used it for philosophy. They sent essays disguised as legal appeals, poems filled with coded political references, and letters that doubled as recruitment manifestos. Inmates across the country received what looked like harmless writing but carried deep ideological messages about unity, resistance, and black empowerment. One FBI intelligence brief described ADX BGF members as operating like a think tank for radical inmate movements. From solitary cells they studied law, human rights treaties, and the writings of revolutionaries like Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon, and Mao Zedong. They filed grievances not just to challenge discipline, but to expose contradictions in the Bureau's system of control. Their leader during the late 1990s and early 2000s, known inside as Brother G, was serving a life sentence for conspiracy to commit murder. He never spoke on record, never appeared in interviews, and never touched another inmate's hand for over 2 decades. Yet through coded letters and loyal intermediaries, he helped structure one of the most disciplined underground organizations inside ADX. The BGF's strength wasn't in violence, it was in ideology. Members swore allegiance not to drugs or power, but to a code of honor called the Black Book. It demanded self-education, loyalty to the cause, and absolute secrecy. Those who failed were deactivated, a word that sounded bureaucratic but often meant death. The Bureau of Prisons struggled to categorize the BGF. They weren't driven by profit, and they didn't fit neatly into racial gang dynamics. Their writings referenced colonialism, capitalism, and liberation, terms unheard of in prison discipline reports. They were prisoners who saw themselves as political prisoners. And ADX, with its isolation and sensory deprivation, became their university, a place to harden resolve, refine ideas, and turn endurance into strength. Psychologists who studied long-term solitary confinement often found that most inmates deteriorated, hallucinations, paranoia, suicidal thoughts. But among BGF members, something unusual happened. They adapted. Meditation, mental exercises, even silent recitations of revolutionary texts became coping mechanisms. They built inner worlds stronger than the concrete around them. A former ADX staff psychologist described it bluntly. They trained their minds the way other gangs train soldiers. You can lock the body, but you can't lock a philosophy. But the danger of that philosophy was how it spread. BGF members were masters at influence. While the Aryan Brotherhood and Mexican Mafia fought for control of the yard, BGF members quietly recruited, in libraries, in law classes, during court transports. Their message appealed to young, angry inmates who saw themselves as victims of a broken system. Through a mix of politics and pride, the BGF became more than a gang. It became a movement, one that viewed ADX not as punishment but proof of persecution. By the 2010s, reports surfaced of BGF-linked inmates leading hunger strikes in other federal and state prisons, coordinating through coded legal mail that originated from Florence. Investigators even traced manifestos smuggled out of ADX to protest groups on the outside, connecting prison ideology with street activism. To the Bureau this was alarming, not because of violence but because of influence. A guard can stop a fight. He can't stop an idea. The existence of organized ideological gangs inside ADX raised a troubling question. If the world's most secure prison couldn't isolate a movement, what could? Inside those concrete walls, 3 powers now coexisted. The Aryan Brotherhood's militarized white supremacy. The Mexican Mafia's criminal empire. The Black Guerrilla Family's revolutionary ideology. Each had adapted. Each had evolved. And as the years passed, the balance of power inside ADX began to shift from physical dominance to psychological warfare. The Bureau of Prisons had built the most secure facility in America, but what they hadn't realized yet was that ADX Florence had become something far more dangerous than a Supermax. It had become a breeding ground for evolution. The gangs weren't dying in the dark. They were learning how to control it. ADX Florence was built on one promise, that absolute isolation would mean absolute control. But as history proved, you can cage bodies, not belief. Behind the walls of the Alcatraz of the Rockies, gangs didn't just survive, they evolved. The Aryan Brotherhood learned patience. The The Mexican Mafia perfected structure. The Black Guerrilla Family weaponized ideology. Each group adapted to a world without touch, without sound, without sunlight, proving that power doesn't need a crowd, it only needs conviction. Letters became lifelines. Silence became code. And fear became currency. For the Bureau of Prisons, ADX was meant to be the end of the line. But for the men who refused to break, it became something else entirely. A cathedral of control where the strongest minds learned to rule in solitude. Even today the same walls stand, clean, white and quiet. But beneath that silence lies a truth the system can never fully erase. The gangs of ADX Florence didn't die. They adapted to the future. And as long as the American prison system keeps breeding isolation, those evolutions will continue, in new forms, under new names, through new generations. Because inside ADX, every whisper carries a legacy. And every cell holds a story that refuses to end. If you found this story eye-opening, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us for more real stories from inside America's most secretive prisons. Comment below what you think. Did ADX stop the violence or just teach it how to hide? Until next time, this is Behind Bars TV, where we bring truth to the darkest corners of the justice system.